The console war was fought with blood codes, dolphin trauma, and Shaq doing kung fu. There was a time when video games didn't explain themselves. They just dropped you into a level, killed you instantly, and expected you to thank them for the privilege.
Hey, you're finally awake.
That time was the Sega Genesis era. This was not a console generation. This was a black plastic fever dream. One minute you're playing football with skeletons, the next minute you're a dolphin fighting aliens. Why the Genesis era was so insane. The Genesis wasn't just competing with Nintendo. It was trying to look Nintendo dead in the eye and say, "Your mom thinks you're weak. Suck it, Trebek."
Suck on it, Trebek.
Nintendo had Mario. Sega had attitude. Nintendo had polish. Sega had blood codes, licensed chaos, screaming FM synth guitars, and box art that looked like it was designed by a guy who airbrushed Vans in 1987. And that's why the Genesis library feels so weird, because developers weren't just making games. They were throwing elbows in a console war. The Genesis era was where sports games got violent, cartoons became punishment devices, movie tie-ins actually tried, licensed games got deeply strange, and every mascot looked like it had a court date. The games that made me. Now, before we get into the Hall of Madness, I need to say this. These are the games that made me. Not because they were all perfect. Some were masterpieces, some were crimes, some were clearly designed by people who hated children. But they formed the wiring. These are the games you played on a carpet floor 6 inches from the TV with a controller cord stretched across the room like a booby trap. No updates, no patches, no tutorials, just you, the cartridge, and the knowledge that if your mom vacuumed anywhere near the Genesis, your save file was going to meet God. Mutant League Football. The NFL if everyone had rabies.
Rabies kills nearly 4,000 Americans every 1,000 years. Rabies.
Let's start with Mutant League Football because this game is what happens when Madden takes gas station drugs and joins a metal band. This wasn't just football with monsters, this was landmines, bribed refs, exploding players, death by sports, and team names that sounded like they were rejected by GWAR. The mind behind Mutant League Football, Michael Mannheim, later discussed the series' fan response and legacy in interviews around the spiritual successor, Mutant Football League, confirming how long the cult audience stayed attached to that original violent sports comedy idea. This game understood something the NFL still won't admit. Football is more fun when the ref can be murdered. Allegedly. Legally, I'm talking about pixels. Then there's Rocket Knight Adventure, a game about a sword-wielding opossum knight with a rocket pack, because in the 90s, every company looked at Sonic and said, "We need our own animal with attitude." And Konami apparently opened a wildlife book, pointed at a possum, and said, "That one." Rocket Knight Adventure was Konami's attempt at a major mascot platformer led by Nobuya Nakazoto, who also worked on major Contra titles. That explains why the game feels less like a cute mascot platformer and more like a high-speed action game wearing a cartoon mask. Sparkster doesn't feel like a mascot. He feels like Konami smuggled a Contra character into a children's cartoon. Number 3, Contra Hard Corps, the Genesis game that hated your entire family. Now, speaking of Contra, Hard Corps is not a game. It's a hostage negotiation with explosions. This thing is brutal. Literally, fast, mean, loud. The hardest Sega Genesis game of all time. And unlike earlier Contra games, it goes absolutely sideways, with branching paths, multiple endings, weird playable characters, and a difficulty curve that feels personal. This game doesn't want you to win. It wants you to apologize. And that's very Genesis. No mercy, no warm-up, just, here's a boss the size of a warehouse, good luck, idiot.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Now, we get to the cartridge that changed playground politics forever, Mortal Kombat on Genesis. Nintendo cleaned up the blood. Sega said, sure, it's censored. Then they quietly handed children the sacred text, ABACABB.
You get into battle, you will see gallons of blood flying around.
The Genesis version's hidden blood code became one of the most famous cheat codes in gaming history. And Sega Retro notes, the ABACABB code is reportedly a nod to the Genesis album ABACAB. That code didn't just unlock blood, it unlocked Sega's entire brand identity. Nintendo was the responsible parent. Sega was the cool uncle who says, don't tell your mom.
Take this quarter. Go downtown and have a rat gnaw that thing off your face.
Number 5, NBA Jam, basketball after drinking lightning. NBA Jam is what happens when basketball becomes a religion and the priest screams, boom shakalaka!
Say, ooh.
This game was chaos. 2-on-2, no fouls, flaming basketballs, dunks from orbit. Designer Mark Termel has talked about wild under-the-hood systems like rubber banding, where the game could subtly adjust stats to keep matches tense. The Genesis Mega Drive version also had hidden players entered through initials, because apparently even basketball games needed secret identities in the 90s. This was not a sports sim. This was Looney Tunes with sneakers and a gambling problem. 6. Shaq Fu, the bad game that became immortal. Now, we reached the forbidden cartridge, Shaq Fu. A game so weird it feels like a fake game someone made up in a sitcom. The original pitch from Dolphin Software was reportedly a basketball game, but Shaquille O'Neal pushed for a fighting game because he was a Mortal Kombat fan.
I am Shogun, loved by no one.
The team used rotoscoping by filming Shaq and stunt performers, then redesigning them as fighting characters. So instead of a basketball game, we got Shaq entering another dimension to fight demons, which is insane, but also exactly the kind of sentence the Genesis era was built for. 7. Spider-Man and X-Men, Arcade's Revenge. Superheroes meet childhood punishment. This game had Spider-Man, Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm, and Gambit. It should have been impossible to mess up, and yet, here we are. Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge is infamous for its difficulty, but the soundtrack has its own cult reputation. Credits and retro music sources identify Tim and Jeff Folan among the composers, which explains why part of this game sounds like they were written for a better game trying to escape. Number 8. Toy Story, the movie tie-in that actually worked. Toy Story on Genesis is one of those games where you expect a cheap licensed garbage game. And instead the cartridge goes, no, we brought animation.
Psych! That's the wrong number!
The Genesis version of Toy Story was developed by Traveler's Tales, and some sources note that it was the version with all 18 levels, while other versions cut some of the stages. It also had pseudo 3D driving sections like Daytona, which feels like the Genesis screaming, I can do polygons too, watch me suffer.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Number 9. Real Monsters. Nickelodeon weirdness in cartridge form. Real Monsters is exactly what happens when Nickelodeon gives the Genesis homework. It's gross, weird, colorful, full of characters swapping mechanics. You control Ickis, Oblina, and Crumb, which means this game basically said, what if a platformer had 3 playable anxiety disorders? Number 10, Jurassic Park. Yes, you could play as the raptor. Jurassic Park on Genesis deserves respect for one reason. It lets you play as the Velociraptor. The Genesis game was developed by Blue Sky Software, and unlike other playable versions, it offered playable campaigns either as Dr. Grant or the Raptor. That alone makes it historically important because every child in 1993 looked at Dr. Grant and said, cool hat, but I want to be the murder lizard. 11. Lethal Enforcers. The plastic gun era had no chill. Lethal Enforcers is where the Genesis said, what if arcade violence came home and made your parents nervous? This was a light gun arcade shooter brought into the living room and the Genesis version used a Konami justifier, a bright plastic gun accessory that made every living room feel like a mall arcade with worse lighting. This was before every accessory needed to look harmless. The justifier looked like a toy designed by someone who had only heard about responsibility in a meeting one time 10 years ago. Sonic & Knuckles, the cartridge that ate other cartridges. Now, we get to one of the most Genesis things ever made. Sonic & Knuckles, a cartridge with a hatch. Because Sega looked at regular cartridges and said, that's not weird enough. Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles were originally planned as one larger game, but time constraints, cartridge size, and cost, as well as schedule issues led to the split. Lock-on technology then allowed the two games to reconnect into Sonic 3 and Knuckles, while letting other players use Knuckles in Sonic 2 or unlock blue sphere stages with many other cartridges. So don't think of this as a DLC. It was actually a physical DLC. You didn't download the expansion, you just jammed another cartridge onto its skull. Disney Animation smuggled into a Genesis cart. Okay, Aladdin on Genesis was one of the biggest flexes of the entire era. The Genesis version was developed by Virgin Games in collaboration with Sega and Disney Software, and it was totally different than anything Capcom's SNES version did. Disney animators contributed hand-drawn animation, which actually converted into sprites. Then it gave the game its unusually fluid look. The source code preservation work later revealed development materials and unreleased content, showing just how much craft actually went into making this game look like a playable cartoon. This game moved better than half the cartoons on Saturday morning, and unlike the SNES version, Genesis Aladdin actually had a sword, because Sega knew what the people wanted: street crime in Agrabah. 14. Battletoads. Children's entertainment designed by war criminals. Battletoads is technically a game. Emotionally, it's a punishment ritual. This series became infamous for punishing difficulty, and the Genesis era carried that reputation like a badge of pain. This game looked like a cartoon, then it beat you with a lead pipe and asked you if you wanted to play two-player. The 90s had a whole category of games that looked kid-friendly and played like they were mad at your bloodline. 15. Finally, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist. This was the Genesis's answer to Turtles in Time. And like everything Genesis, it came in slightly meaner, slightly grimier, and with more arcade energy elbow grease. It's shorter than Turtles in Time, but it's fast, aggressive, and built for replay. This game feels like Konami looked at the SNES version and said, nice theme park, now let's make a back alley version. The Genesis generation was weird, because nobody knew the rules yet. Developers were experimenting, publishers were panicking, and Sega was willing to release almost anything if it looked loud enough. And that's why this era still matters. Because before gaming became an industry obsessed with algorithms and engagement metrics, it was chaos. Beautiful, loud, confusing chaos. The Genesis didn't just give us games, it gave us scars. And honestly, that's love. Side effects! Playing these Genesis games may cause irrational loyalty to black plastic cartridges, yelling ABACABB like it's a religious phrase, believing Shaq can save another dimension. I'm pretty sure he already's done that. Sudden urge to blow into cartridges even though everyone said not to. It's literally the only way. If symptoms persist longer than 30 years, congratulations, you were made correctly. Pop pills! Your prescription for pop culture.